Greetings from the cosmic horror. The stars are right once again. The great old ones allow us to talk about for 30 plus minutes. H.P. Lovecraft, the horror writer who's a genre unto himself. I'm your cosmic host, Mark Griffin, executive of the Lovecraft estate on Yaga, joined in by two from Material World, David Guppy, a professor at Miss Patonic University, and Richard Wilson, who would love to kiss everyone, but he just washed his hair. Our favorite Bill, the one with one L, Bill Richards, was supposed to be a guest host today, but is having health problems and couldn't join us. We hope for a speedy recovery. Today we'll be discussing the late writer Harry Harrison Kroll. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Richard Saunders, Dean of Library Services, at Southern Utah University and the author of Never Been Rich, The Life and Works of a Southern Ruralist. And welcome aboard, Dr. Saunders.
Thank you.
You described Harry Harrison Kroll not as a Southern writer, but as something else. What was that?
Well, when you think of Southern writers, you often think of Faulkner and a number, Eudora Welty and whatnot. But those are writers with a capital L. And Harry Kroll was a ruralist. He was very much interested in the rural experience as opposed to capital literature. And he had no real interest in Eudora Welty or Faulkner's publishers. He treated writing as a business, and he pursued it his entire life. Sometimes he was very successful, and sometimes he wasn't. So that's the way I would describe him as a ruralist. And yes, he is a Southerner, but he was more closely tied to land and landscape than either of the other two that I've named there.
I want to go back to one of the high points of probably his career is when he taught at Lincoln Memorial University at Harrogate. Is that how you say that name?
Harrogate, yep.
Harrogate, Tennessee. He had a few promising students there, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And they did very, very well. He was Jesse Stewart's mentor. Although Don West kind of resented Kroll a little bit. He was a mentor for Don West, and James Still completely disavowed him, but I think that he affected Still. Still was more connected to Kroll's rival on the faculty. But he did something that at Lincoln Memorial that no other faculty member had done. He was the first one to ever publish any sort of a book. And that was a big deal, and it got him in trouble, but it was at least the first book. And there have been a number of people who kind of explored that whole group of writers. I don't think it's been done well. There was an LMU professor who I think was doing the best work on that whole group, and I wish she had put together a book, but she put together a bunch of articles that really go in depth into that whole experience. And the fact that Kroll was there, he was kind of a catalyst. I don't know that he was a cause, but he certainly was a catalyst for the thinking. And what he really brought was the idea that you could make writing a business. It didn't just have to be artsy, didn't have to be entertainment. It could be practical, and you could make money off of practical writing, like trap nesting or pickling foods or things like that. His students, as according to his term, his students began writing and selling things, and it made a huge splash. Stewart specifically cited Kroll as a major influence. And I think that he probably gained his appreciation of writing as something that wasn't agrarian, didn't have to be, capital L, didn't have to be artsy, capital A. It just had to be good. And I'll tell you, John Crow Ransom and Taylor and the other bunch, I don't think their writing holds a candle to some of the stuff that I've seen come from Kroll and his students. I just don't think the Fugitives had much to them, frankly. They got famous, but that doesn't mean they were good writers.
That's interesting. So you say
that's
that
just me too. I mean, it doesn't have to be accurate. There'll be lots of people that argue with me. But
for those who don't know, what's the fugitive art movement, literary movement?
The fugitives, or the agrarians, later became the agrarians, were a group of writers that were centered at Vanderbilt University, beginning about the war, 1918. And they were kind of centered around Dr. Edward Mims, who taught at Vanderbilt. But they were very much, in my opinion, they were very much a self-congratulation society. They were very conservative. Nashville at the time was the center of the Lost Cause, Daughters of the Confederacy, Lost Cause, myth-making venture. And they very much got into it. In fact, in his autobiography, Stewart points out that you couldn't just go to Vanderbilt and get into that circle. You had to be invited, and he was not the right person to be invited. He wasn't Southern gentry. He wasn't a privileged background, and as a result, they didn't have any interest in him. I think he talked to John Crow Ransom one time, and maybe a couple of others, but they had no interest in Jesse Stewart. But Stewart outwrote all of them, as far as publications go, and as far as significance goes. We look at literature, capital L literature, as influential, but I don't think so. Not compared to someone like Stewart. Stewart and West and James Still, they really shaped a whole genre of literature. The fugitives and the agrarians merely reflected it.
So I guess probably the best known of the fugitives would be Robert Penn Warren.
Right. Okay. Now he was significant. Yeah. He genuinely was significant, and there were other ones too. Alan Tate. Alan Tate was evidently significant as an editor. That's kind of outside my field, but unless one is interested in mid-century editing, he disappears. He's virtually unknown.
And so you're saying that the literary movement at Lincoln Memorial University had more of an impact than what happened at Vanderbilt.
I think so. And like I said, people argue with me, and yes, the agrarians, the fugitives, the agrarian "I'll take my stand" was itself influential, but it was influential in kind of an insipid way. It was a statement, but it didn't go anywhere. It's a very collectible book, but it really didn't go anywhere. What happened was they simply, I think, they reflected what was going on around them in Nashville with this attempt to lionize the Confederacy as the lost cause, and they bought into that. Stewart says it beautifully. He says, and I think Penn Warren actually picks up Stewart's comment years later, and he says, we weren't agricultural and we didn't farm. So when you talk about the agrarians, it's much more pretension than it is actual thing. I mean, they didn't. They were making a social critique more than anything else. And I guess social critique has its merits, but I'm much more interested in what people actually produce. And so some of them, they all had careers in writing of some sort. But they're virtually unknown today, and Jesse Stewart certainly isn't. He's still read these days.
In fact, I just saw they just published a new book of this stuff. It just come out.
Yeah,
it was Kroll. I think it's sense that he was really blinded by the Confederate cause or anything, the lost cause or anything.
Well, Kroll kind of ignored it. He used Confederate characters occasionally. But only because he could sell a story. He wasn't political in the same way that the agrarians tended to be. And while he wasn't an abolitionist in the sense of the old abolitionist, he was at least sympathetic with his black characters. He didn't relegate them to, a re-dressed up form of second-class status, although that's essentially what everybody was living in the South at that point. It's a curious story. I haven't done an awful lot of work about, real serious literary analysis. I'm a historian, And I was interested in Harry Kroll because he came from the little town that I was living in at the time. And he got interesting. So.
And he didn't have much. He didn't have much of an.
No, go ahead.
He didn't have much of an education as a kid.
Well, no, he was largely self-taught. He eventually, at age 18 or maybe 21, ended up going back to grade school and kind of flew through school as a young adult, and then went on to the Peabody College in Nashville there and got his master's degree. But yes, he was very much self-taught and self-practiced. Now, there's a great story that I think I put into the biography, and I've seen it a couple of places. He had a bit of an arch rival on campus at University of Tennessee at Martin, or what's now UT Martin. And she had asked him one time, he was famous for carrying around stacks of student essays and writing, and then going through absolutely every one of them. He made an attempt to read absolutely everything that his students produced. And his approach was, somebody asked him one time, Mildred asked him one time, why do you have your students write so much? Nobody else does this. And his answer was, as he's holding this stack of stuff under his chin, you can't become a writer in 10,000 words. It takes 1 million. And that's exactly what he had done, is that he had simply written and written and written and written until he learned how to get into the groove. And in many places, he kind of talks about his ability to sit down at a typewriter, generate a story, send it out, and have it sell without ever coming back. And that was really the way that he approached the process of writing. As a result, he published 900 pieces of short fiction. There are not too many other 20th century writers who even come close to that. Even people like John Updike, they've got 35 or 40 stories, and they're known for their stories, but 900? And those are just the ones that I've been able to identify. That doesn't include hundreds of stories that he sent out that never sold, and he just simply gave up on and threw away. And it doesn't include about 11 or 12 other novels of the 20 books that he published that he maybe had revised and revised, but simply discarded as well. So the man was constantly writing. He actually made writing into a reasonably well-paying profession. He was never a serious writer. He never made money off his royalties the way that Faulkner did, but he wasn't competing in the same aspect of writing and literacy as Faulkner was.
He seemed to be completely without ego when it came to writing. If an editor wanted to make a change, he'd do it.
Oh, absolutely. He would do anything to make it sell. The issue was selling. That was the point. Whether or not it ever was used in publication, it didn't matter to him as long as he was paid for it. So he looked at it very much the way that a poor boy looks at an opportunity, is that, here's a way to make an income. And I don't have to break my fingers working in a mill. I don't have to, risk being disemboweled by machinery in a factory someplace. I can sit at my typewriter in my house and make a living. And for a while, he did pretty well. He was never a Eudora Welty seller. Never really got that together. But I think it's a fascinating look at an aspect of American literature that most scholars ignore. And that is the common literature that was circulated around the United States in tens of thousands, millions of pages that never hit Harper's or Atlantic or New Yorker or things like that we typically think of as literature. He wrote for the pulps in the heyday of the pulps.
When his first novel, The Mountainy Singer,
mm-hmm.
Did that get him fired, or did he decide to quit?
Well, yes, both. He was going to be fired. He simply stormed off and left. They absolutely didn't want to have common literature on campus. They wanted high, inspirational, ethical approach to literature, things that people could aspire to. And that's not the way Kroll worked. I mean, it was And what happened was he lost the argument on the faculty between what's the acceptable form of writing. Is trap nesting for a local newspaper that pays you 85 cents or $1.50 or $2, is that acceptable writing? And his argument was yes, because it sold. And his colleague's argument was no, because it's not uplift. And that's what Lincoln Memorial was founded to do, was to uplift the last pure Anglo-Saxon stock in America. It was tremendously racist. I mean, it flat out was racist. But it was a time when race was understood differently, and that was the assumption. That's how the university was bankrolled, was to educate the Appalachian Anglo-Saxon, the Scots-Irish that had settled in the hills of Tennessee and Kentucky and what became West Virginia and North Carolina.
I guess in some ways you can say that Kroll did uplift, his students, because he did get them to get published and paid.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a different form of uplift, though. Getting paid is one thing, but they were looking at Shakespeare and Keats and the icons of Western literature, English literature. And he said, ignore them. Write what you think needs to be there, and tell your stories. Tell your community stories. And so it worked for the 1920s, because that was the heyday of what was called the color story. And color is not a racial issue. It's looking at things with character and language and odd, adventure and all those kinds of things. So that was the period of color stories. And that eventually went away in the 1930s. And that's when Harry Kroll's salability as a writer began to decline as well, because he had nailed the color story, but he wasn't able effectively to make the shift in magazine publishing, where the real money was, after the Depression. And I go into that in his biography if your listeners want to read it. I think I'm one of the very few people who really have dived into the low-level literature, the common literature that fueled all kinds. I mean, everybody. Reading was the single most popular pastime in America prior to the invention of radio and the movies and talkies. And those two things were a double whammy that basically ended the publishing sector, the uncontrolled hold that publishing and reading had on American attention and pocketbooks.
So it's kind of a scary story thing about that.
Well, it's not scary. It's a natural output. People, well, statistically, if you're interested in the numbers, between 1920, network radio is invented and becomes public in 1924. Talking pictures take over, with typically the jazz singer is identified as the first American talking picture in 1927. Between 1927 and 1935, half of the Broadway theaters closed.
Wow.
Half. And what happens was it became possible to build these small theaters in places like Dyersburg, Tennessee, or all kinds of small towns, and then make them go, because now with audio coupled to the movies, you had a narrative form that's essentially storytelling in the same way that adventure fiction had been, or romance fiction, or other kinds of things, science fiction to some extent, that had been available in print in the pulp magazines prior to that point. So about 1935, 1932, I can't remember the date. It's the mid to early 1930s. By that point, statistically, every man, woman, and child in the United States attended a movie at least once a week. That has got to have eaten into the income from magazine sales, which had been everything. Magazine and newspaper sales had been everything. So it's a fascinating nuts and bolts look at reading in America that that I don't think we've really had a real appreciation for. But Harry Kroll had tapped into that that market, and because of that, he became, he had a minor career as a writer.
And it was, I guess, his second novel, Cabin in the Cotton, is what made him kind of a minor celebrity.
Well, that's his third novel. His second one was, excuse me, no, you're right. That is the second one. Cabin in the Cotton was important, but it was important chiefly because of the cultural reference that I noted there when you were talking about David. I think it was David. No, Richard.
Richard.
Yes. I'd kiss you, but I just washed my hair. That was a line lifted right out of Cabin in the Cotton and put into the film that Betty Davis says. And 20 some odd years later, she wrote Kroll and said, that is my all-time favorite movie line. And that was kind of her trademark for a long, long time, is that I'll kiss you, but I just washed my hair.
She would still utter it when she was being recognized by the American Film Institute. She said it one of the last words, to them and all that.
Yeah, that was a good line. And he eventually went back and turned that into a pot-boiling paperback novel, paperback edition, by adding about a dozen pages to it. And the book was good, and I think it's still good. It kind of ended weakly, but it was his attempt at social criticism. But the novel after that, Three Brothers and Seven Daddies, that did not go well, and because of that, he was never really able to make a career as a serious novelist. He wrote, but his opportunity to get into the New York publishing scene just ended up with that one. And it really is not a very good novel.
With Cabin in the Cotton, I know Alan Tate reviewed it, and he gave a review saying, I wish it was written better, but I'm glad it was written, basically, what he said about it.
Well, yes, and Tate was right on that, because it was very much a social commentary on the status of poor whites in the cotton economy, the Southern cotton economy. And there are things in it that are really good, but the closing part of the book, it just falls apart, which is really sad, because he had you up until the end of the book, and then it's just like there's this weird courtroom scene that just falls flat. And I think he'd reached the limits of what he really knew. He'd never been in court before, so he didn't know how it would go, and as a result, he could write the social challenges of being a cotton cropper, but he didn't know how to get out of that as a literary writer because he'd never been out of it himself. So Tate was right in that respect. It was an important book, fairly important book for its time, but it reflected, I think, as much the limitations of the author as the subject. If he had spent some time, been a little less busy writing it, and a little more focused on some research for it, I think it'd have been a much better work. But the movie's a good one.
How do you feel about the movie?
I like the movie. I like Betty Davis. Richard Barthelmess, who was a declining silent movie star, was supposed to portray this 17-year-old kid, and it's absolutely unconvincing. I mean, he is just simply a middle-aged guy. There's no way around it.
Yeah, I thought it was odd that they had him play like a kid.
Well, he was a big name. Betty Davis was not at that point. She was just an up-and-coming person. That was only her fourth or fifth film, and she wasn't a draw. In fact, when Warner Brothers put out that film, they didn't even put her on the movie poster. The only movie poster that was ever produced was Richard Barthelmess, and people would have known him at that time. And he later goes on to be a fairly important person. He was U.S. Army intelligence for D-Day, the D-Day invasion. He worked in military intelligence in the Second World War after his film career.
Yeah, I remember Betty Davis was talking about his the way he acted. For this, some of them he did close-ups. He did a really good job, get really dramatic. He did the far away shots. He just kind of did nothing. He was just kind of, he looked like he was bored a lot of times in the movie.
Well, yeah, and that's part of the evolution of film and filmography. They understood how to film people, but they didn't really yet understand how to film scenes. And that was the problem. So, it was made the way it was made, and it's a piece of film history by itself. And that's about as much as you can say with it. Kroll made about $3,500 or something like that out of that film, it was absolute. The publishers could have sold that book for 3 times as much, and they simply grabbed the first offer, which was like $7,500. And that was a time when the film industry was paying tens of thousands of dollars. So they just jumped prematurely.
I have down in my notes, he was paid $12,500 for the film.
Is that what it was? Okay, yeah. And he made half of that as the author. So he bought himself a car, which made the newspaper in Nashville, made the evening newspaper in Nashville. And he kept a mistress for a while, I found out, after the book was published.
Yeah, I'm curious about the mistress. Jesse Stewart talked about her.
There was a group of letters that surfaced after the book was done of Stewart to Kroll to Stewart. And that's where that information came from. I had suspected so, but I didn't have any hard evidence, so I left that out. Yeah. But oh yes, in fact, Jesse Stewart had visited Kroll's mistress on more than one occasion.
Yeah, that was like, what you refer to her as N? Was that the letter he gave her?
I can't remember. It's been too long since I've looked at those letters.
But he was feared he caught something from her.
Yep.
At one point, and
yep.
Not exactly sure whether he actually did or not, but the doctor did treat him regardless.
Yep. But, Kroll never did. He got off scot-free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it did allow him to become a minor celebrity in Tennessee, and he did a lot of traveling and speaking and even attending film premieres in the city.
Yeah, he did.
So
he did. The film premiere was held by arrangement with the studio in Dyersburg. And then afterwards, it had a New York premiere at a theater that was actually a very respectable opening. It was a 3,000 seat theater, and they had filled the place. But the New York Times reviewer did say that Dyersburg, Tennessee, has to be the smallest place to ever premiere a Hollywood film. And he later wrote about that a book, and it was really interesting. I pointed out in the biography that the theater in which Cabin in the Cotton premiered sits directly across the street where Kroll had sat in the window of the Western Union office as a messenger kid 20 years earlier. So there was definitely some karma coming back to him on that one. He felt it was, and he was thrilled because he pointed out where he had sat and came up on stage and took his accolades, and he was thrilled. So yeah.
That was his, I guess, the story where he wrote about attending the film premiere. That was Lost Homecoming.
That's Lost Homecoming, right? And it's not absolutely accurate, but Kroll tended to use scenes and experience on which to build a story. It wasn't the story in itself. So, for instance, he talks about Dyersburg, Tennessee in his book, I Was a Sharecropper. But almost nothing about that experience is anything we can actually document. Now, admittedly, there's very little. But he used it as a framework to hang the story. And that's what he was most interested in, was the creative part of it. I think he could have been a really good essayist, a nonfiction essayist, but he wasn't interested in that. He didn't figure it would sell. But if you look at someone like Terry Tempest Williams, who has made a lot of career out of growing up in southern Utah, it can be done, and it can be done very, very well.
Bing Crosby had a song called Cabin in the Cotton that came out the same year as the movie. Are they connected any?
Oh, probably. But I'm never able to document a direct connection, and so I just let it go. I should have mentioned it. You're right, but I didn't.
Which is always kind of curious. And going into other things that Kroll has done, he definitely went into other genres. He did a few detective stories,
Mhm.
and, westerns, and
He
even wrote
attempted a
rules.
Western. Well, he didn't really attempt a Western. He attempted something he was much more Appalachian. So he tended to be either an Appalachian writer or a Mississippi Delta writer. And that's kind of where he split. But that's where he lived as well. He had lived time in Appalachia. He had lived time in the Mississippi Delta. And so he knew both of those areas very, very well. And spent time going around and listening to people. And that was, I think, one of his great innovations that Fugitive certainly didn't do, is he listened to people and then worked them into his stories. So they could find themselves here and there. There was a young adult novel he did called From Chloe with Love, which was written about a basketball player he had as a high school teacher, who was, as he described it, the fastest thing on two legs he'd ever seen. And her name was Cloy, C-L-O-I. The publisher wanted a traditional spelling because it was easier for readers, and so it became C-H-L-O-E. But again, it's that idea of hanging experience on, using experience to hang a story on it. So a lot of it, while it is autobiographically informed, it's not actually autobiography.
And let me see. Some of the stories I've come across, the titles very intrigue me. They sound like Hardy Boy stories, or something R.L. Stine would write, like The Mystery of the Covered Bridge or The Haunted Treehouse.
Yep.
Stuff like that. And then he wrote My Father for Esquire, and then My Mother for Atlantic Monthly. And I must say that his opinions on his mother, I'm often shocked, some of the stuff he'd say about her.
Oh, she was furious. She was livid. She had aspirations to be a genteel individual, and he absolutely, completely took her to talk. But she was not a nice person. From everything that I can find through the family, she was a social climber. She was brash and coarse, and he captured that. His father was an incompetent dreamer who never did anything. He had, the way Kroll put it, is he was looking for the place where fried pies would fly into his mouth, or fried pigeons would fly into his mouth. And so, what can you say you can't be very sympathetic with a character like that. So she was furious, and his sister, who took care of their mother in her declining years, she and Harry got along quite well. Bertie and he got along quite well. His just younger sister didn't, because she was very much like their mother. And the one thing that he consistently praised his mother for was the same thing that any rural man praised his wife for, and that was she worked herself to the bone. She knew how to do all kinds of things, and she worked extraordinarily hard. That was the life of a poor white sharecropper at any stage. And that, I think, gets lost in the portrayal of her that he puts out in My Mother. And I think that he was at least paying her respect as somebody who did what was necessary, didn't complain much, and who wanted better things in life. But everybody wanted better things in life. I don't know if you're familiar with the Flaubert short story, or maybe it's Flaubert. I may have the story wrong. Anyway, there's a very famous French short story about a young wife who borrows somebody's jewelry, goes off to a party, is the life of the party, comes home, and the next morning goes to return the jewels, and they're gone. So she and her husband go into ruinous debt, and they basically lose their place in society to repay they buy a replacement set of gems, give them back, and then spend the rest of their adult lives paying back this. And then years later, they discover she bumps into her neighbor from whom she had borrowed them, and she says, well, she's coarse, she's work worn. She says, well, I paid you back and you never knew it, but by golly, I did it. And the woman said, oh my word, those were just paste, they weren't worth anything. So it's the same kind of approach. Harry Kroll's mother could have been more elegant and should have been a little less gauche, but she was what she was. But Kroll pays her the respect of saying she knew how to work and she knew how to take care of things. I think he was closer to his father, but his father was just a dreamer and never really did anything.
There was another story that he had published in Atlantic Monthly, The Second Wife. And
yes.
I
That
forgot
is
one of the
unquestionably his best work. He hits it right on the head, right out of the ballpark with that story. Anybody that hasn't read that one, that's worth a read. Yeah. And it's worth a read right up to the very last sentence. It's just fantastic.
I wish he wrote more like that.
Well, yes, and I think he did too, because he made $250 off of that one. Part of the thing about literature, and this is the one thing that Kroll never really understood. He started coming close to it, but he never really grasped it. The really great fiction that is memorable has something that is timeless and can apply across cultures and time. Okay, Second Wife absolutely nails it within one sentence toward the end of the story. And the whole story is all about to set up that one sentence. If you read Orson Scott Card, for instance, if you read his Ender's Game and the sequel to Ender's Game, it asks some very, very deep philosophical questions about survival and what can we do as a human race to survive? How far can we go before we become the enemy? Faulkner's work, a lot of it deals with the edges of acceptable society and what happens when you go over the edge. So if it has something timeless, if it's more than just a pastime reading, that's what Kroll did. He had pastime reading, just interesting stories, sometimes adventurous stories, sometimes tragic stories. And he knew how to set up a plot, but they didn't mean much, except for a few of his things. I think Paw Jack Watermiller is another one, if you haven't read that one. That one was published in a Caxton book that's really quite good. And he's talking about a character that he actually knew in Alabama. Alabama, Southern Alabama, who had run a mill at the end of the point at which, a water mill was just a luxury. It was a rural luxury. It was no longer necessary because you could get grain from, you can get grits at the local grocery store. So that's the kind of thing that this idea of ruralism, and that there's a past and a status and an ability and an existence that is simply going away in America. And he, to some extent, was mourning it, because all of many of his characters come back to the rural experience that they have had and known, to find it gone or changed or turned into some other type of an opportunity or something else.
And we get to why he's on this podcast. He wrote 3 stories for Weird Tales.
He did.
Yes.
And you have to remember, especially in the 1920s, Weird Tales was merely one of hundreds of pulp publications. And they were called pulps because the paper was just basically junk. It was pulp paper. It was groundwood pulp paper. And it was meant to be sold and thrown away in 2 weeks when a new issue came out. The pulps, especially Weird Tales, made its career because of Lovecraft and because of a number of other early publishers that were really good, that really did produce some good fiction. But you have to remember that the pulps, the real challenge of publishing pulp publications was that you had to have something to fill them. They weren't short publications. They were 200, sometimes 300 pages. And in 300 pages where you have a dozen or 2 dozen, well, a dozen writers, those stories are going to be long. They're not 3 and 4 pages. They're 15 and 35, sometimes as long as 120 pages for a single story, for a novella. And there was a real market for marginally good writers like Harry Kroll to get into these pulps because they sold by the hundreds of thousands every week. When you look at the old movies and you see newsstand, and we still use the term newsstand, those were just jobbers that would buy up batches of new publications and sell them on the street because they could make a living at it. And newsstand publications, they dealt with current stuff. They didn't sell books. They didn't even sell paperbacks because paperbacks were fairly uncommon. But they sold pulp magazines and they sold newspapers. And the two were not exactly interchangeable. The news was usually local, but the pulp magazine, there was adventure fiction and romance fiction and sailing and lawman fiction and detectives. And I mean, there were hundreds of these things, literally hundreds. And so you could go and pick up a stack of reading like this, and that was your evening for weeks at a time. You would sit down with the lamp or with the new early light bulb, and you'd read. And people would read to each other, and they'd read to the neighbors, and they'd loan things back and forth to see what was going on. I think the one that really kind of lasted the longest was Argosy. I don't remember if anybody knows Argosy. Argosy was a major publication. It lasted into the 40s and 50s. Science fiction, it started off as analog. It started off as science and fantasy fiction, became analog, and that's still in publication. But they began during this period when it was cheap to produce literature, and there was a market for marginal writers just to fill the pages. So while Lovecraft is the one that's remembered, there were probably hundreds of people like Harry Kroll that generated story after story after story after story. They got paid $18 or $25 or $58 or whatever. The prices went up over time. But the magazines were so desperate for content, anything that read reasonably well usually got published. The Street and Smith archive at Cornell University has the story purchasing records, and they're incredible to go through because there's card after card. There's thousands of cards for thousands of writers, each of which sold Street and Smith at least one story. And there are literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of writers who do that. After 1929, after 1929 for sure, because of the Depression, but after the introduction of radio and the movies, and then the Depression on top of that, it got harder because there was less cash in circulation. And so the magazines started consolidating. Publishers closed, like Red Star closed, Red Star Publishing, and others simply just disappeared, or they cut back their title offerings so that they had enough to just keep going. And then World War II happened, and that absolutely finished off the pulps. That there was nothing for them after that point. They morphed into different kinds of magazines like True Romance, okay, trashy, common, but much shorter, and those tended to make a jump toward nonfiction, or at least presumed nonfiction, personal narrative type of things, rather than just honest to goodness created stories.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite of his weird tales that he's written?
Not out of his weird tales. I don't think they're some of his strongest writing, but that's what he's remembered for. I mean, obviously you and I are talking because you remember Harry Kroll. He was a character that was there. Was the Old Stone Fort in Weird Tales? Did that end up there? That wasn't there?
Yeah, Ferry Gossamer.
Ferry Gossamer was a good one.
Bloody Moon. and Graveyard Skunk were the three that got published.
Yeah, I was not. Graveyard Skunk is not one of my favorite stories. I liked Fairy Gossamer. I thought that was a pretty good story. I think his better fiction, frankly, was written for Sunday school publications. You have to remember that Nashville, Tennessee was the center of American denominational publishing. It was even bigger than Chicago or New York. And the Disciples of Christ, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Church of Christ each had a publishing house in Nashville, Tennessee. And their Sunday school newspapers they had, reading material for all kinds of people, but they published short fiction, and he published a lot of short fiction, and some of it's pretty good. He had a couple of Christmas stories in there that I wish somebody would collect and put together, because he could turn out a really impressive story. Number of fortune stories of his were actually not too bad as far as literature goes, but I really like his agricultural fiction best of the stuff that he worked with. His novels, they became decidedly popular. He aimed for the paperback market, and unfortunately he hit it.
I looked through some of the past issues of Weird Tales, see if there's any readers' response to his short stories, and I can't find any comments whatsoever. They leave no impression.
No, and, but remember that those magazines got tens of thousands of responses, and they only published a few dozen. So, could he have gotten? He very well may have gotten some. I don't know. But I agree with you. I don't think they were. I don't think he wasn't a notable fantasy writer. He was too much tied to reality and existence to genuinely be a really creative writer, and to come up with like Cthulhu and all the characters that kind of begin around that period.
That's I've noticed about his stories is a lot of times they're very reality based.
Oh yeah,
they're almost like sometimes like a Scooby-Doo mystery. Maybe something mysterious happens, but you can easily explain at the end as being something completely rational.
Yep. No, that's Harry Kroll. That is very much Harry Kroll. He was anchored to reality. Now he used it to build stories on, but they were always based in something traditional. He made one attempt to do a novel on the Bell Witch, and it failed miserably because he kept trying to, from what he described, he kept trying to put things into it that simply didn't happen, and he couldn't pull it off, which was really unfortunate because I think he could have done that one well. But by that point he had lived through his reputation. I think as a short story writer, he was a novelist. He had to produce a novel, and I think he just wasn't suitable for that story. He was too tied to reality to really think about what was going on, and he couldn't make it go.
He did set one of his stories near here, Bloody Moon, which is close to Warren County, the Lost River Cave, and mentions Mammoth Cave and all that. And I thought maybe Lovecraft might have noticed it because he was always interested in Mammoth Cave. But I've looked through his letters, I can't find any mention of ever coming across the story or anything. If he did read it, it didn't leave much of an impression on him.
Yeah, I don't know. Part of the problem is there was so much going around that it's very difficult to really get a sense of what people were reading at the time unless they left a record. Part of the other problem is that we don't have a lot of writers' papers from the period, just like you point out. Even in Lovecraft's material, I don't know that, can you actually trace what he's been reading most of the time? Because that would be fairly unusual for most writers.
Lovecraft, if he loved something, he would write in his letters to other people about it. And or sometimes he even wrote the Weird Tales, and they would publish it in there. Some of the stories that he liked. Mm-hmm. So I would. So he would. Well,
he was a major writer, and Harry Kroll was not. Part of the thing that frustrated me in putting together his biography is that he finally reached a point where his name was saturating some of the pulp magazines that he could get into, and so he started using pseudonyms. And I was able to identify several, but not all of them. And so there's a good possibility that he was writing and publishing stories under somebody else's name that are really him. That became a fairly common practice, even for major writers, because they didn't want to saturate the market as for too much with stories. Now, major writers like Lovecraft, I don't know, but T.S. Stribling, he had the same issue, and Stribling published almost as much as Kroll did.
One thing about Graveyard Skunk is that he also illustrated it.
Yes, he was an illustrator as well.
Make a note of, like, when he did Cabin in the Cotton, had illustrations in there as well, and he was quite a good illustrator of certain things.
I thought he was a pretty good illustrator, at least for the period. And he actually started an interest in pen and ink illustration because he found out he could make about $6 more. Well, he could about double the price that he got for the illustration for what he got for the story, because they typically paid you by the word, by the story. It's like a penny a word or 3 cents or something like that. But if he was doing an illustration, he could make almost twice. And he said, well, duh, then you learn to be an illustrator. Interestingly enough, when he went to Lincoln Memorial University, they had of one of the alumni magazines, one of the magazines that was there, he did a pen and ink illustration and had an LMU that he did. They're still using his drawing today for the LMU logo.
Wow.
Nobody's really paid attention to that, but it's the one that he did in 1928, 1929 maybe.
Wow.
But yeah, they're still using it.
There is one illustration, I'm sure you've seen it. It's an illustration of a cabin, and it has a little kind of a macabre look to it. Looks like it has eyes in the windows, and there's like the trees almost look like bodies. Do you know the story behind that illustration?
There's a couple of them, and I know where the original drawing is too. It's hanging on a friend's wall in Eastern Kentucky. Just a second, I'll even tell you the town. Anyway, it was given to her mother, and she has had it, and I've seen it. He did it because he actually dashed that one off specifically for the family, and then it got published, and then it went from there.
So was it for something? Was it supposed to tell a story? I mean,
it was supposed to tell a story, I think, but it was as much as anything just an opportunity to do something different. And
there was one story that I found of his that seemed like it was probably the closest I ever got to doing a supernatural story. I don't know if they ever got published, but it was called Graveyard Story.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a photograph.
That one got published, if I remember right, in just a minute. It was in a book called Teenage. Just a second, I'll look it up. I can tell you what it is.
Do you have them cataloged?
I do, as a matter of fact. It's one nobody has ever seen. Darn, what was it called? Teenage Ghost Stories. That was the name of the book. It was Teenage Ghost Stories.
Teenage Ghost Stories.
Yeah, and it's a 1950s, 1960s collection of, kind of supposedly thriller stories. No, this is the catalog that I did. I can't get it anyway. And nobody's ever seen it because I did it as a private publication. I did all this work and I thought, oh, what the heck? I'll just do it privately. So there's a few copies floating around in some of the institutions that deal with Appalachian literature, but it's not common.
Okay. So that was like, but he also had a photograph he took with that. I guess that was the inspiration for the story. He took this picture of like himself by a tombstone, and someone looked at it and thought it looked like there was a ghost in there. So I guess he wrote the story.
Yeah, if you take a picture, you publish it in a book it's going to have a ghost in it.
Yeah.
He was a very avid photographer. In fact, he was a photographer before he was a writer. That's what got him out of being a sharecropper, is that he figured out how to, what they called, smoke pictures to make and develop photographs. And he and his brother, Charles, or Chotty, had gone around central southern Alabama as itinerant photographers, just taking pictures of schools and classes and people and whatnot. And he landed in Citronelle, Alabama, and decided to make a break, and had learned about story writing, decided to go back to school, and in a tent in an orchard wrote his first story. And he said it was terrible and it was awful, but it was my first story. So he was a fairly accomplished photographer. Unfortunately, very few of his photographs survive. I don't know whatever happened to his negatives or anything else, but he did not keep much of anything. It was really hard to put together a list of his publications. In fact, I actually had to go to places like Nashville and Alabama and have people look in, the Methodist archives at Drexel University and go through page by page and look for Harry Harrison Kroll stories. That was the only way that I could find them. But they just kept coming. And that was what was so remarkable, is that he published literally hundreds of stories.
I am quite impressed with how prolific he was.
Oh, yeah. And I think I probably only got about 75%, maybe 80% of them. There's too many publications that have just disappeared, and no one has ever seen them since.
There's one story he wrote that the title intrigued me, so I had to read it. It was called Headless Nude Co-ed. And I have to say, it ended up being nothing I expected it becoming.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And there are two versions of the story. So
yeah, and he recycled stories occasionally. You have to understand part of why he wrote that story. His house in Martin, Tennessee, was directly across the street from what was then the only female dormitory on campus. And so he let his imagination kind of run wild with him. He wrote a couple of when he needed to in the early 60s. He started writing for men's magazines, which meant he was writing essentially pornography. But that was where he could publish at that point, and so he did a couple of those. There are a couple of story manuscripts where he kind of skates the line, but he came by it honestly, if not exactly above board. He had a string of liaisons that was years long, casual relationships outside of his family that, I got to shake my head at, but that's the way he lived.
I want to mention one later on in this interview, but I want to top it up. Some of his other stories he written first. Ghost of Slave Driver's Bend. I've only read the first chapter of it, and it kind of gives a sense it's going to be a kind of a mystery story, but knowing Kroll, I haven't done it. Do I?
Yeah, it tries to be. And actually, that's one of his few translations. It was translated into French and published abroad.
I love the cover to it. I thought like one of the best covers of one of his stories.
Yep. And that one was also published in Britain, which was a hard book to track down when I was building the collection. The Ghost of Slave Driver's Bend is supposedly about this. Well, it was supposedly a mystery, but it's much more of a rural up and coming story. And again, it's a little strange. It's not very well written, not one of his better books, but if you're a teenage kid and you're not thinking really deeply, then it's okay. Interestingly enough, I found a reference fairly recently to something very much like that, and I was wondering if there was something that may have tipped him off. I can't find my reference. I wrote it down. This mess I have called an office. It's got lost someplace. But it's supposedly, they find this skull with a mark in it that is obviously a murder, but they, what's the story behind the whole implement? And, you go from there. And it has to have a love interest. All of his stuff has a love interest in it.
Of course. Slave Driver's Bend is also mentioned in Cabin in the Cotton. So is this like a shared universe for him?
It was. He didn't do it quite like Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County. But he wrote about Coahoma County, Mississippi, which is right below Memphis, and had lived in a little town called Lula, which is out by Clarksdale, where the blues are born. Okay. But he he was kind of starting to build himself a world, and he had several other. The Usurper, by the way, is the same kind of a book, set in a similar area, set in a little town called Rich, which was next to Lula. And yeah, he was very much tied to geography and to culture, but he never let that stand in the way of a good story. So Slave Driver Bend shows up in a couple of publications, and I believe there actually was one once upon a time. But the bend was a river bend that I think disappeared in the 30s or 40s, like an oxbow leg.
And Period's Journey, that was a story that he, I guess, finished for another author who passed away.
Mm-hmm.
But that,
yep.
And that kind of inspired him to do another book story called Rogue's Company.
Right.
About John Muir, the land pirate.
Right. And that one was one of his early genuine historical novels. He actually took a character and the guy who denounced him and turned it into a fictional version of that story. And yeah, John Merle was a real person, and had made his fortune and lost his fortune and eventually his life on the Mississippi in the early 1830s and 40s, when steamboats are just beginning to ply the waters, and Mark Twain isn't even yet on the scene to catalog that experience.
I was thinking that he did get mentioned in Tom Sawyer's story, didn't he? Or just mentioned in passing?
He might have. I don't remember.
I think it was like,
I haven't read all. I have probably read all of his stories, but remember, this is a long time ago, and I've done a couple of things since then.
And then I Was a Sharecropper, which is I guess his attempt as an autobiographical novel.
It was autobiographically informed. In fact, I knew his second son. I knew Harry's second son. And when I talked with Tori, he said we went back one time. He and his family went back when he was fairly young, teens, and they drove around Dyersburg, and his dad pointed out places that he remembered from his growing up years, but he never took him to their home place. And he said, I could never really reconcile that story with what I saw. And the answer is because it isn't what he saw. It was made up. There was large sections, especially in the second half of the book, that was made up. His father actually doesn't die in Dyersburg and is not buried where a road cuts across his grave. He's buried with a headstone in Alabama, where he died of consumption at his daughter's house. So he was using Dyersburg and this idea of a poor white man that never goes anywhere in life as a way to hang a social comment on an actual person. And it's really unfortunate, because I think he could have really done a better job if he'd have just stuck with the facts. But he didn't.
I guess he thought fiction would sell better.
I think so. He never let it get in the way of the story.
And then there was Water Over the Dam. Eudora Welty really liked that story.
Yes, she did. That's because it's from her country as much as anything else. And Water Over the Dam is it was written in a very short time. He sat down and basically typed that out. And that's from the time in Citronelle, Alabama, where he really appreciated the people and the characters that he knew, but also the loss of that whole rural world. I mean, it was disappearing just very, very quickly. As soon as roads start getting paved and automobiles become more powerful, these little tiny woods towns out in central Alabama and southern Mississippi, they lose their isolation. They're no longer the center of people's world. And he's really the last generation. Well, not exactly the last generation. He's the second to last generation for whom the 19th century is even real. And so, then you get the World War II generation who really does leave the farm, and it's basically gone by the time you get the Civil Rights period. So it's very much of a time.
We mentioned Lost Homecoming earlier, but I was want to also talk about there's an Alan Tate-like character in that story, and I guess like Kroll was trying to get his revenge on the review.
Absolutely, he hated Tate. He despised Tate. I mean, absolutely despised Tate. He thought he was a Oh, what did he call him? Oh, he had a phrase for Tate, and he thought Tate was below contempt. He wasn't a writer in Kroll's view.
And this didn't get published as a book, but it was a 12-part serial in the newspaper, Sporting Blood. And I thought it was interesting. That's probably the best way I can describe it. I wish it was almost like he was trying to do a detective story or sent up a film noir, but didn't really know how to end it.
Well, and that was his problem. He didn't have any experience ending something like that. He could write the story, but unless it was something that was very real, he was outside of his experience. And yeah, Sporting Blood was one of those ones. It was written as a newspaper serial. It was published as a newspaper serial, and that's the way people bought it and read it. And if the thing fell flat, they had still bought the newspaper. That was the point, is that there was room for all kinds of this odd marginal writing that it didn't have to be good. It just had to be good enough. And it worked for a lot of things. It worked.
And their Ancient Grudge. And this one is still in print.
That's because I put it in print. Yeah, that one is a genuine, significant novel. I think it's probably more significant than Cabin in the Cotton, because it's one of the ones that he holds closest to as far as the factual stuff. In fact, it was really unfortunate. I got robbed of a bestseller. He got robbed of a bestseller in 1947 when it came out because of a paper strike. A trucking strike ended the paper supply for reprints, so the book didn't stay on the shelves and it simply fell apart. But I found out after my edition of that book came out from the University of Tennessee Press that a television producer was looking at that as a tie-in for a made-for-television series on the Hatfields and McCoys. And I made the foolish mistake of saying Kroll made some mistakes. And they said, well, then we don't want it. So, oh, well, it goes where it is. That book, yes, Kroll stays pretty close to the actual action. What he does, however, for his own devices is to compact all that action that happens over years, actually over a decade or more, into something that looks like it happens in a fairly short time. And it didn't. It was very much a back and forth type of thing. And actually if you've read the introduction to that particular edition of the novel, you'll see where the flaws are. And there's some really good writing, but scholarly writing that came after that. But Kroll's novel, Kroll's version of that story is very human in ways that the scholarship just isn't. And for that, I think it's his best book. And I'm glad it's in print. I'm glad it stayed in print, because of all of his work, I think that's the one that deserves to be there.
If I remember correctly, didn't a student of his inspire that story for him?
Well, he had a student who was a Hatfield that worked in his office. And she was his entree into the Hatfield side of the argument. And she opened doors for him that nobody else would have, to the troubles that nobody else would have allowed him in to see. So he got to hear firsthand stories. And his introduction, which I think you'll find in the back of the book, is really quite a good one. He talks about going up there in the winter where it is gray and cold, and where the possibility of an endless feud just seemed completely real. And I think that's a really good way to put it. He relies a little bit too heavily on color, language, dialect, trying to capture the mountain dialect. But that was the nature of the time. That's what he grew up doing. It was one of the last dialect stories, major dialect publications in the United States. Past that point, people tended to back way off of the dialect, simply because it read more easily for people. But it's a good book.
Did it get translated into French?
I'm sorry?
Did it get translated into French?
It went to paperback. Let me think. Did it get translated? Yes. No, Spanish.
In Spanish.
It got translated into Spanish. Odio Antiguo. Yeah. And are you doing this as a video or an audio blog?
It'll be both.
Both? Well, then let me show you the picture and I'll see if I can get it up close enough you can actually see it.
I remember seeing one cover for it. It looked like definitely they were trying to drum up the sex appeal of the story, make it like a
Well, it is, and that's part of the problem with cover art. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that. That's a little, that's the Spanish, the British, and the paperback version. The British was an embarrassment. I mean, it's just, they've got the Tetons in the background and the guy's wearing a cowboy hat. I mean, it's just, no. But that's what the British understood. So that's what made the cover. And, the author had absolutely nothing to do with the cover. They had no input onto that at all. That was all about marketing. So didn't matter. If it's sold in England, then that was fine.
That still happens today, it seems like.
Oh boy, does it ever.
Yeah. And there was one of his other books. This is the one where I first heard of him. It was Riders in the Night.
Yeah.
Tobacco Wars.
Yeah, that was another, and that's another good book. It's that one's probably even more historically accurate than Their Ancient Grudge. But Riders in the Night isn't as important a story. It didn't get deep into the psyche of American culture the way that the Hatfield-McCoy Grudge feud did. And so it was published by an academic publisher. It is, in fact, a novelization, but it's a pretty good one. He did pretty well with that.
Dr. William Turner over in Hopkinsville says it's his favorite account of the Tobacco Wars.
Well, it's a good account, and he illustrated that one as well. My former institution, University of Tennessee at Martin, has the cover art that he drew for that.
I love what he had to say about Russellville, which is where we're based out of. Tom was like, in that story, says, Russell seems to have done a little better in preserving its pristine grandeur. The traveler with a taste of antiquity can leisurely trace its quaint streets, and your hostess will point out this or that noble pile where the flower of chivalry and properly dry cleaned tobacco tires and sweat danced all night to waltz, and gay blades drew their bellies off into the distant gloom of magnolias and recited, with slightly alcoholic breath, Byron, Keats, and Shelley.
Mm-hmm. So, well, you can see he's both poking fun at Russellville and also giving it a compliment at the same time.
Yeah.
I think part of his antipathy to the Old South was the fact that he was absolutely not of the gentry class. He was a Peckerwood, a real honest to goodness Peckerwood. And as a result, just didn't have much truck with the genteel South, or even those who aspired to the genteel South. In fact, you can see that in another one of his novels, Keepers of the House. Keepers of the House was a Mississippi novel written about an illegitimate son of a plantation owner who ends up on top of the heap, quite literally, after the Civil War, because he simply works his way into it, and the son and the daughter are just no accounts. They're petty bourgeois or petty aristocrats that have no competence, and so he keeps the house. He keeps it going. So that's Kroll had no sympathy for the wealthy, none, zilch. He wanted the money, no question, but he did not sympathize with anybody that put on Southern airs, none.
Yeah, we have some of that. And one of his last books that he wrote while he was alive was Bluegrass Bells and Bourbon.
Yep, that was a commission work. And the whiskey distillers in Kentucky, up around Bardstown, paid him to come up and write that book, and supplied all the images that he wanted. And he volunteered for it. He said, here's something you ought to think about. And they said, okay, well, you come and do it. And so they paid his way, and he loved it. He had a blast. He had been a teetotaler and grew out of it. His wife died an alcoholic and only after she died did they find out she had cancer. And the reason she was an alcoholic is she was trying to simply deal with pain. But he had fallen off the wagon years earlier. And he thought that was pretty cool because that was a working man's drink. Whiskey was a working man's drink. And that's where he started kind of maybe sympathizing a little bit with the Kentucky Blue Bloods.
Talking about his wife, he did try to write a sequel to Cabin in the Cotton, but he never had much luck with it. But his wife got a hold of it and rewrote it to Return Not Again.
Yeah. And that ground his teeth. Torrey, his son, I knew his oldest son, Harry Jr., but Harry died well before I started this. So I never really got to talk to Harry the way that I got to talk to Torrey. And their third brother, had died as an alcoholic tragically. And Harry writes about that, as a matter of fact, in his own stories or in his own letters. But Torrey said that he wasn't quite so sure how much his dad actually did or whether his mother actually did write that novel. And so the question is, we don't know. However, she's the one who got credit for the book. She's the one who put it together, but I can see Harry Kroll's fingerprints all over it. What really galled him is that book was the one that got him into Bob's Merrill and got him basically restarted his career as a novelist. He had not been successful after the publication of Three Brothers and Seven Daddies. And he became successful after the publication of that book under his wife's name. And that got him the entree to Bob's Merrill that he needed to continue any sort of career at all. If it hadn't have been for that, then I suspect Kroll would have disappeared entirely.
So how does that book compare to all of his others?
It's a story about wealth and poverty among the poor whites of Mississippi. It involves an illegitimate child, which was far more common than people want to admit. But it's a tragedy, and it's written as a tragedy, and it's written more importantly from the woman's perspective. And Harry just flat out didn't understand women, but she did. I think she was a better writer than he ever gave her credit for. In fact, he never really tolerated her as much else than just kind of a tolerant spouse. But she never said a word that she didn't write that book. And I think that was her getting back at him for his stepping out on her over decades. Is that she had one stick that said, I made you relevant, that she was not going to relinquish.
Do you feel it's kind of a missed opportunity there, that maybe if they actually had their eyes open, they could have collaborated together, made more stories together?
No, he wouldn't have collaborated. He did one collaboration that I can point to, and that's Mounds in the Mist. And Mounds in the Mist, even that, he wrote he wrote virtually the first half of the book. And then after he passed away, then his co-author actually did some writing and ended up with a much more readable and factual end of the book. He was a fiction writer. He was not a nonfiction writer at all, although he probably could have done so if he'd have set his mind to it, but he didn't want to. He wanted the fast sale, and that's the way he looked at literature, was just something that sold and then go on to the next writing project. Okay,
we'll get to the other woman in Kroll's life. She's been called many things, but I think one of the best descriptions is like she's a muse, at least. And how do you say her name? Kalia Hicks?
Kalia
Hicks.
And yes, I know her daughter quite well. I haven't been in touch with her for a while, but yes, Kalia Hicks was a disappointed writer, absolutely terrified, terrified of public speaking, and for that reason, she never wanted to finish her degree. but she was kind of the worshiper for Harry Kroll in his later life. And Harry finally found somebody who appreciated him as a writer again. Late in life, when his stuff simply wasn't selling and he wasn't teaching any longer, he was retired. But he got to sit on their front porch and begin affecting the kind of linen suits that he had just been fought against for decades. And he got to be a patrician, and he really liked it. And so I think that there was, I don't think there was an infidelity involved in there. I just don't think so. But there was very much a spiritual infidelity. He loved her as the daughter that they never had. He always wanted a girl to raise and never had one. And she wasn't quite young enough to be his daughter. Well, she may have been, but she was very much a frustrated writer in the same way that he had become a frustrated writer. And so they ended up being very good friends for a long, long time.
And after he died, he did give her $500 in his will.
He did, which wasn't much, but it was the only person outside the family to whom he made a bequest. And he did it specifically so that she would finish her education. You know, he was supporting her that way.
So I have to admire Kroll just because it seemed like, he kept on writing, literally up to the day he died.
Yes.
And despite
very much.
Despite
maybe toward the very end of his life, the last few months or weeks, he probably stopped because the cancer was just killing him. But he had made an attempt to write quite literally up until nothing else would sell, and then he discarded everything, which was really unfortunate because it had been great to have all those manuscripts.
It'd be interesting to see what he thought was trash.
Yeah, I would love to have found that stuff.
Yeah, and after he died, Jesse Stewart wrote a story about him, My Crazy Professor.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely a very great tribute to him.
I think so. I think it's one of the nicest things a student has ever said about a mentor. And Stewart was very sincere. What I think Kroll really gave to Stewart. Stewart was a writer long before he met Harry Kroll. He was a poet. He was a writer. He was something. But what he wasn't was a businessman. And that's what Harry Kroll taught him, is that you can send this stuff out as gritty and as coarse as it is. And Stewart's style is very plain spoken. But I still go back to These Dark Hills, or Beyond Dark Hills. I love that autobiography. It's beautifully written. It's lyrical. It's not lyrical in the same way that James Still wrote River of Earth. But boy, it's a wonderful biography, and a story of somebody written at age 23, no less. So an autobiography at 23, and it's very readable. So, I think Kroll's great contribution as a writer was the fact that people who were not litterateurs with a capital L could still write and still be important to America. And I think that's a great lesson. There's room for all kinds of writing, especially now in the internet age when everybody can produce their own book. I think that's important. It leaves us more stories to be told. I just recently found a book of absolutely atrocious poetry from the Bighorn Valley up in northern Wyoming. And there's only 4 copies of it in the world, any place, in any library. So I made sure that copy went to an institution that was going to take care of it, because it's one more piece in the American puzzle. It may not be good poetry, but it says something about the time and the place that nobody else will. And having it is important just because it was done. And that's very much the way I see Kroll, and very much the way I see writing of his period, is that we've forgotten that most writers are unremembered. I think Faulkner, personally, I think Faulkner is severely overrated. But he's popular because he made an ascent. I mean, not everybody wins a Pulitzer Prize, right? Or a Nobel Prize. And that makes him someone to study for the ages. But there's tens of thousands of writers that we need to pay attention to not for who they are, but for what they became as part of an aggregate and this whole literary experience that was just reading, just the way that we read as people.
So do you feel we get more of an accurate portrayal of like American society through studying these writers as opposed
I think
to like Faulkner?
Yes, in some respects. I think Faulkner is probably more enjoyable to read. And Hemingway and Fitzgerald. I think Fitzgerald is irrelevant to much of it. The only reason he's famous is because he's famous. But the problem is access. It's so hard to track down who these people are, and there's so much of their writing. And to really get a sense of what's there, you have to read so much that it's just simply easier to focus on the big names because everybody else is. Kroll is one of those ones for whom writing was a business and a life. And there's lots of people that were like that didn't do really well, but they did well enough that people started to recognize them. When you put hundreds of people together, then you get a patchwork that shows you much more of America. And it's not that what they say is necessarily what is America. But if you step back and look at the patterns, you can see a truer version of America, I think.
All right, well, we got one last thing. I usually like explore one word on the episode, and there was one word that Kroll used, and you mentioned it earlier, but could you explain what peckerwood is?
Peckerwood. Yeah, at the risk of offending your readers, calling a poor white man peckerwood is like calling a poor black man a nigger. That's the origin of the name. That's about what it was. However, because they were poor whites, peckerwood kind of became fairly socially acceptable, where nigger simply isn't and shouldn't be. But that's where you have to be careful with language because meaning shifts over time. And I remember my dad, who had never been to the South, occasionally spitting out peckerwood when talking about somebody locally. I'd never heard of that as growing up, and it wasn't until I moved to the South and became an academic that I really began understanding there's a history here, and that's the origin of the term. It's not a polite term, it's not a kind term, but it's an American idiom that has a time and a place in American descriptive life that probably shouldn't be resurrected.
And it was also going to be the original title for Cabin in the Cotton.
Yes, it was. It was going to be the Peckerwoods. Yep.
Anyway, David, Richard, and the rest, I see the stars are no longer right. We must cease all discussions until they align again next month. 30 Plus Minutes with H.P. Lovecraft is sponsored by the Betty Davis Shampoo. You never want to kiss anyone again. This podcast was created in association with LovecraftPod.com, the Logan Speculative Fiction Group, with the help of the Lone County Public Library, the Great Old Ones. Special thanks to Katie Tyson for the cyber commands, Josh Dukes for the cheeseburgers. Until we meet again, may you avoid the wrath of Princess Cthulhu riding with the Night Riders.
There you go. Thank you, gentlemen. Send me a link when you're done.